Hello, welcome to Severance Season 2, Episode 1, Questions and Theories. This will be a series that I go over the questions and theories that are going to come up with each episode that airs on Severance Season 2. I do apologize, even though I know not that many people watch my channel for the late upload. I've just been very distracted this week. So many things have been happening, so many questions about how I should approach my content creation. But right now, I'm just at the point where I want to get consistency going. So I made a promise to have a midweek review of questions and theories, so here it is. So let's get into our first question. How much of that Lumen story is real? So some of the first dialogue we get from the season 2 premiere is Milchek explaining the situation of the innies to Mark. It is likely that the entire explanation is a lie, but let's explore what I think is a lie and what I think might have a kernel of truth to it. Milchek explains that Mark and his friends have become the, quote, face of innie reform, unquote, and have been celebrated on the outside. As many people have noted, the photo used in the newspaper clipping that is shown to prove that there is celebration is really just a Photoshop image of the team photo that they all have on their desk and an excerpt from the JFK ticker tape parade. So it is edited to provide the most grandiose depiction of what's happening on the outside. However, the implication that there's a grandiose blowback for what has happened for the innies is not that far-fetched. Helly did explain her situation in front of a large audience who intended to receive favorable innie portrayal. However, in a gala situation, the audience tends to be filled of supporters, and we saw that with the state senator and his wife, who we know is using Severance in order just to deliver babies. So her innie only experiences delivery, which must be such a traumatic existence to have. And we also know that these supporters pay tickets in order to attend. It is possible that public press was invited to the gala, since clearly the gala was intended to shift public perception of the severance procedure, but we'll have to wait and see what the true aftermath of the gala is. Overall, I think it is not possible that the three team members did interact on the outside, and it's really kind of conceivable that Helly's big speech, which could have been really shocking to everybody in the audience, could be easily course corrected. She said something to the extent of like, we're not happy, we don't like it down there. And while this is a stereotype that a lot of people have about, what's happening with the innies, think about season 1, the Whole Mind Collective, this idea that they're being abused. Maybe they could have said, hey, Helly or Helena Egan was just joking. This is what all these people like the Whole Mind Collective think about what the severance procedure is, but that's not actually what's happening. So I'm excited to see what the actual aftermath of that speech is, because for all we know, it does nothing to anybody's pre-existing perception on what the severance procedure does. Another discretion is that Milchek is still unpacking his office when he's talking to Mark. He explains that Mark has been out of work for 5 months, but that doesn't really make sense with the circumstances that we're seeing Milchek in. We know that Miss Cobell was fired before the overtime contingency was operated by the innies, so it doesn't make sense that it would take 5 months to transition Milchek's office. Another timing discrepancy is that Milchek's office is still overwhelmingly unpacked by the end of the episode, when he's telling Dylan about the Audi family visitation suite. I think we are seeing the same day between Mark S being quote-unquote fired for trying to sabotage Mark W, and then the original macro data refinement team being reunited. I believe Lumen is testing different reintegration procedures, and basically what we see in episode 1 of season 2 is plan A and then plan B. But basically they had all of the team members available for that day at work. They just didn't send them down until they had plan A tested out. That's my theory right now. So my current theory, to flesh it out a little bit more, is that the events are at max a week out from the initial overtime contingency event. Lumen and Milchek are trying to determine the exact level of harm they are in. While they are clear on what Helly did, they probably don't know the full scope of circumstances involved for Mark and Irving. And remember, Dylan had to stay inside Lumen, but Mark, Irving, and Helly were the ones who were able to go out. Milchek does know that Cobell served as Mark's sister's who Devin, a nursing wife or lactation expert. So they might have already done some preliminary investigation, but not enough to determine just how motivated somebody like Devin may be to expose Lumen for its practices. It is completely possible that even Helly's efforts, again, are inconsequential broadly, because galas tend to be events for supporters. The general public becomes aware of what happens at these galas only through the attendees, and I think the attendees at the gala for the Egan family are probably very motivated to keep their mouth shut in regards to a potential situation where an innie is saying that they're actually being abused. Anyway, I think we will get confirmation of exactly what's happening in the next couple of episodes, and hopefully maybe even episode 2. So let's go to the next question and theory. Will we see the other MDR team members again? So, in the season 2 premiere, we're introduced to 3 new MDR members. First, there's Mark W. and Gwendolyn Y. And they're from a more technology advanced Office 5X. Their office has been closed down, and Mark W. believed he was actually going to be retired, which again means that you're dying. As an innie, your life only begins once you are severed and you're put into Lumen, and then your life ends the last time that you go into Lumen. Mark W. describes his former colleagues as quote-unquote dirtbags who never hit the quota. Not hitting quota to me seems kind of difficult unless his former co-workers were obsessed with uncovering the mystery of Lumen, which distracted them from the work at hand. It may be the reason why their office was closed down in the first place. It would make sense that around the world, Lumen is fighting any rebellions at different scales all the time, and sometimes it might get so bad that they have to shut down an office. Gwendolyn Y is extremely curious about Mark's adventures on the outside, but we don't get more from her besides that. It seems that there's a slight tension between Gwendolyn and Mark W, and my question is, does Gwendolyn belong to the group of people that Mark W saw as dirtbags? You know, that would be a really great kind of insight to know, because it kind of would contextualize what they're doing. However, Gwendolyn doesn't seem curious about Lumen as a whole, and she's really actually mad at Mark S when it's revealed that he tried to frame Mark W. So it seems as though maybe Gwendolyn, she's curious about the outside world, but maybe not so curious as to actually do anything about it. Like, she wouldn't ever be involved in an overtime contingency event because she just never get that far in her curiosity, or allow her curiosity to go that far. So the third member, the member who's centered here in this video, is Dario. Dario is Italian, and we can assume that he comes from an Italian office, although that's not necessarily clear. I had one theory about this, which is, what if Dario's like one of those Americans, and I say this because I'm also a child of immigrants to America, which apparently is a controversial thing now, but Dario, what if Dario was one of those kids who was born in Italy as a kid and only learned English well into his maturity as an adult? So maybe one of the reasons why Dario can't speak seemingly proficient English here is because his innie is the childlike version of himself, and the childlike version of himself only really is proficient at Italian. I don't know. That's a far-fetched idea, but just something to play with. But anyway, we know that Dario comes from an extremely under-resourced office. Apparently, he had to take a rope to go down to the severed floor, and they had brooms for CPR dummies. He has a wooden carving on his face, which is a cheap proxy to the glass holographic cube Mark has on his desk. So why does Lumen have such disparate conditions in their office? Is it intentional to test the effects of severance in different circumstances? While I understand different countries and different locations have different cultures and resources, because for global companies, they determine the budget of each office based on the revenue they expect to receive. But still, you would think that basic accommodations would be provided. Italy isn't known to be a beacon for office culture, but it seems extremely primitive to have them contemporaneously use a rope to descend to the lower floors. Some have speculated that Dario is actually from the past and was some cryogenically frozen being, but that doesn't make sense because the Severance program only started around when Helly was a child, and we know that she's 30 years old, so an elevator would definitely still be around in the beta sections of, you know, creating the Severance chip. Although, again, maybe Lumen has been working on like cryogenically freezing people for years now. And, you know, we do know that at the end of episode 9 of season 1, the James Egan, who's Helena Egan's father, talks about the revolving, and it seems like this interesting way to basically talk about death. We don't know, but maybe Dario is sort of an interesting look into the ideas of how Lumen is trying to use technology to shortcut death or to freeze people in time. But still, I even think, the founding of Lumen was in 1866. They still would be more advanced than to use a rope to get down. Either way, that's a theory that Dario is a permanent innie, essentially, that was cryogenically frozen. So I'm not really sure what's happening there, but I think hopefully we get some answers. Otherwise, that's going to be really depressing if we just never revisit these three individuals. Also, Alia Shawkat is a phenomenal and well-known actress, so I don't know if she'd be willing just to show up in a show for like 3 minutes. So I do suspect that we are going to see these three again. Another thing that is relevant to these new MDR members is that Lumen mentions in their quote-unquote new welcome video that the Macrodat uprising, that they have offices in 206 countries. But in 2025, there are only 196 countries, including Palestine and the Vatican. Many think that this is just another lie from Lumen. But what if Lumen just acknowledges countries that the general world does not? And I know that sounds wild, but this could totally be possible. I don't know. My dad, he memorized all the countries in the world, and he got really messed up because after the Soviet Union fell, he was like, yeah, I don't know all the countries in the world because I don't know all those little things that came up after 1989. Anyway, that is a tangent, but what if Lumen is also trying to create a country of their own? Having additional 10 countries to the real life countries is close enough to the truth, and I think this is simply a hint that we're sort of in an off-kilter reality. We know that the events of Severance take place in Kier, PE. That's what was seen when Irving goes and he looks through the box. He has some letters that are sent to him, and it's addressed at kier.pe, but we don't have a PE state. And one of the first questions that are asked to newly severed innies is to name any U.S. state. Remember, Helly in episode 1 answers Delaware. So we're still in America, but we don't have a state named PE. So what I'm thinking that is actually being hinted at throughout this show is that we're just in a slightly distorted and different reality. It is very similar to our own reality, but it's slightly different. This also explains why it seems like everyone's driving in an 80s car, even though everybody also has smartphones. So again, I just think we're in a different distorted reality where there are 206 countries as opposed to 195. And when you think about geopolitics widely, it's definitely very possible that there'll just be 10 additional countries in a slightly off-kilter reality. So anyway, I think we are going to see the new Macrodat individuals in the new future, but their presence may feel like another cameo since there's already so much to explore with the current existing characters. So I think that's my only disappointment with these new characters. While I love their presence here, at least for now, I'm not really sure if they're going to help move the plot forward. And there's already so many questions about basically everything else that's happening with Lumen and our 4 main cast members that I'm not really sure what was the purpose of introducing them here. They were kind of funny, but still. All right, so let's get to the next question. Kier pardons his betrayers. When Mark and his team reappear in Lumen, they are immediately introduced to a painting called Kier Pardons His Betrayers. The painting depicts 4 individuals in holes in the ground with a sun bearing on them, while Kier pardons them while wielding a very large sword. In the background, we see an army to the right and industrial buildings to the center. When I look closely at the painting, I'm now convinced, not 100% convinced, that this depicts Mark, Helly, Irving, and Dylan. This is primarily because the person that's supposed to be Helly either has her hair cut or her hair up, but Helly never appears that way. And then the Dylan character is like muscular, which I guess just because you're little thickums, and I'm thickums myself, doesn't mean that you can't be muscular, but it does beg the question of whether or not, this actually represents the 4 MDR members of Mark, Helly, Irving, and Dylan. But I do think that there's supposed to be this inference that this represents Mark, Helly, Irving, and Dylan. So, Yeah, we don't really know. I did do some research, however, on what type of torture this might be, and I found that this is actually a sweatbox methodology of torture. And so, according to Wikipedia, it is a method of solitary confinement used in humid and arid regions as a method of punishment. And when placed in one, would experience extreme heat, dehydration, heat exhaustion, and even death, depending on how, when, and how long one was kept in the box. It was a method used during American slavery to punish disobedient slaves, and of course, it was used in many other different wars and contexts where people felt like this made like sense to do to somebody else. Um, and I think it's kind of interesting because a lot of the examples the Wikipedia article cites for the use of the sweatbox method come from the 19th century, which corresponds to when Lumen was founded in 1866. I think we should keep this torture methodology in mind because this may serve as an allegory for how Lumen intends to keep its indies under submission throughout the season. The indies may feel like they have more agency, but actually they're just being put into a hole and made to sweat out from the sun. So I think that this is something really important to keep in mind. I also think that the army of individuals is also really important to keep in mind, right? I'm sure this represents, the army represents maybe people like Milchek, and I don't think it is lost on me that the army has like a bluish tone to them, which you see Milchek and also Miss Cobell, they wore a lot of blue. So they're part of this army. I have another theory in general, and this I did not script, that basically Lumen is trying to create a more perfect capitalism, and this comes from Max Weber's theories on Protestantism and capitalism. And Max Weber thought that basically Protestant ideals were the reason why capitalism was able to thrive in the early 20th century, and he believed that Protestantism ideals were a huge factor in how people were able to find so much worth in pursuing these capitalistic ends. And I think that Lumen, when you think about the way that they talk about things, when you think about how the handbook is referenced, they are very much trying to parallel themselves to biblical proportions as these entities that are doing God's will, but in this case, Keir Egan's will. So I think, again, this is all things to keep in mind about, punishment, because Protestantism, also one of the things that people tend to forget is that there's a lot of fear of sort of hell and fear as well of punishment. And I also think that we see these ideas of torture and punishment in different ways throughout this episode, including the new quote unquote welcome to Lumen video. There's a pineapple bobbing competition which feels, I cannot speak today, which feels like a pricklier version of waterboarding. Additionally, the mirror room, which is another quote unquote new perk, seems like a way to mentally disorient people as they go through a room of mirrors and they're seeing so many different versions of themselves through the mirrors. It seems like a way to confuse individuals. Overall, I think we should pay attention to the inconsistencies in Lumi's stories about any reform, because while they present them, the four macrodata innies as these beacons of hope who have provided great reform, they're also sort of shading them and saying that, hey, you are betrayers of Keir. So that I think is really important to keep in mind. And I think that this confusing back and forth between high praise and condemnation is going to play a role throughout season 2. All right, let's get to probably one of the most talked about aspects of the premiere of season 2. Is it Helly or Helena? I think I'm 80% sure it's Helly. Okay. The main argument people make for why it's Helena is that Helly lies about her experience on the outside. The truth of the matter is that in season 1, we didn't get that much about Helly beyond the fact that she's willing to do anything to get out of Lumen. And I believe the lengths she went to evade the Lumen mandate suggests to me that her innie could be as cunning as her outing in terms of being able to lie on the spot. And of course, she's not even that great of a liar. Irving was able to cop to that, hey, night gardener, also it was winter on the outside, night gardener seems a little weird. I think it is better to think of it from this experience. You're Helly. You learn that your outie is Helena Egan. Your last memory is being knocked away from a microphone because you were calling out the abuse of innies in front of avid Lumen supporters. What are you thinking? Well, you're probably thinking, why would my outie bring me back to Lumen? What does she have planned? Moreover, Helly would know that the primary question of her friends would be, why is Helena bringing you back? So I think that essentially she knows that this isn't going to work if she tells her any friends that she's really Helena Egan, because the number one question that she has, and we have the audience have, is like, well, why would Helena Egan decide to come back down? And I also think that essentially the entire idea that it's Helena is kind of taken completely down by Severance creator and showrunner Dan Erickson, confirming that it is Helly. So here's how he explains why Helly lies to her friends. Helly made the most horrifying discovery that she could have made, because she is, it turns out, what she hates the most. There's a lot of shame that comes with that, and there is a concern that she won't be accepted by her friends. She knows that they all vilify the Egans, and she is one. She doesn't want to have that baggage, and that was released by Variety. So if you just Google Variety, why Helly lies, it gives a perfect explanation as to why that's the case. And also story craft wise, the plot becomes confusing if the other innies learn of Audi Helly's identity too early. It makes the entire plot and the entire dynamic between the four main innies about the skepticisms that they have about Helly, when skepticism works better as the subplot that we're seeing brewing with Irving. So I think the writers knew that if she tells the truth, first of all, that might be characteristically inconsistent, but it kind of just blows up the entire season, and it makes the entire season about, hey, what does Helly think about this? Or, what does Helena think? Why is she back? And it takes away from all the other mysteries that we really need to focus some more time on. Okay, so to be clear, I'm kind of open to the idea that it's Helena, but I'm putting my money on that this is Helly. All right, is the Audi family visitation suite real? My answer is no. I don't think it's real in the way that Dylan imagines it. When Dylan tries to confirm whether he could see his family in the suite, Milchick responds, if you take the name of the room at face value, I'd say yes. If you look at the design of the room, which I have pictured up there, it looks like essentially just an expanded version of the wellness room. The blueprint includes a memory wall where you see a space for portraits. Let me get my little marker. You see that? That's the memory wall. And if you remember, during the wellness sessions, Miss Casey would tell the innies facts about their Audis to lift their spirits. I think that the Audi family visitation suite is intended to be a visual representation of the facts that Miss Casey usually shared during her sessions. I also think the visitation suite might look a bit like an episode of Black Mirror. Spoiler alert for those of you who have not watched Black Mirror, but in Season 3, Episode 5, Men Against Fire, there are military men who have their vision changed to make the quote-unquote enemies look like alien bugs. At the end of the episode, the protagonist military fighter is shown being reunited with his family in an idealistic Middle America scenery. But we learn that the imagery is merely another visual projection. I think the visitation room will be used to depict a faked reality for Dylan, or quite frankly any other innie that comes in there. I think that this room will be used to project to the innie some version of a reality that they're going to be really satisfied and motivated by. And when you think about it, if an innie, for example, like Dylan, recognizes that his work at Lumen, outside of trying to discover the truth of what's happening with Lumen, is supporting his family, is making sure that his family is alive, this is a really huge weapon for Milchick. And ultimately, I think that that's what this visitation room is all about. It is a weapon that Milchick is going to try to yield to break the relationship between Dylan and the other innies. And we do know that Dylan is a very, very powerful member of the team. He was the one who was able to remember the instructions for activating the overtime contingency and staying in that position for such a long time. And he just seemed like a very strong-minded individual. And if he was truly motivated to stop any curiosity activities that the rest of the team are engaged in, I think he would do that. All right, so let's just see if that Audi Family Visitation Center comes up in future episodes. But here's another question that people have been having. Is Miss Huang actually a child? My theory is that Miss Huang is not a child, but an actual visual representation of her innie self. We know that innies are childlike versions of their adult self. Ragebi in Season 1 mentions that Mark's innie is just a baby because he has only worked at Lumen for 2 years. But what about people who are severed and worked at Lumen for, say, over 5 5 years. I think Lumen has been experimenting on different ways the Indies present themselves. Miss Huang's 8 to 12-year-old appearance reflects the length of time that she has worked at Lumen. When she answers Mark W.'s questions about her being a child, she answers that it's because of the year she was born. Technically, innies are born as soon as they're severed, and they die as soon as they retire and never return to Lumen. So the idea of life and death is a bit different, and I don't think that her saying because of the year I was born is distinct from the idea of her actually being a full-grown adult on the outside who, when they take the elevator down to the Lumen severed floor, turns into the physical manifestation of the childlike version of themselves. I see some people have a clone theory, and in general, all clone theories I don't think have a lot of merit. I don't think clones are involved in the show. I might eat my words, and I definitely will if I end up being wrong. I just find clone theories very pastiche, very 90s, and it doesn't really go well with what I feel is a theme of the show, which is about, I think, a company claiming to try to save the world, right? I think that's really at the undercurrent of this entire show, is a company claiming that they want to save the world, but doing it in a really sort of abusive way that ultimately leads to harm to certain people. I don't understand how clones would come anywhere close to helping save the world. I can kind of see, I understand there might be a motivation because of the extreme obsession with Kier Egan. There might be a desire to sort of recreate Kier, but for right now, I don't think cloning is a part of this. Anyway, I think that everything being created about the show is about Lumen creating a more perfect human society through the Four Tempers, which brings us to our last, but definitely not least question/theory. Oh, where's Miss Casey? In one of the last shows of the season 2 premiere, we see Miss Casey reflected in Mark's screen, seeming to do counterpart work to his macrodata refinement. Like macrodata refiners, they have 5 bins that reflect a level of completion. We also see a picture of the 4 circles, which I think reflects the ratio of 4 tempers. Kier believed that every human is some makeup of a different ratio of the 4 tempers. It could be possible that the intuition of the refiners is being used to refine the temper ratio of the permanent indies, who for some reason can't leave Lumen. So from what we know in season 1, Miss Casey was only quote-unquote alive for 107 hours when she was conducting her wellness sessions, and she was retired, essentially put permanently down in the floor after being quote-unquote fired from her wellness director role. So unless there's another level of consciousness for the permanent innies, I don't think she's necessarily actively participating with Mark. I think she might just be in another state of unconsciousness, and that's what we're kind of seeing here, but we do not know what is going on. And I kind of, that's as much as I got. I know there have been a lot of theories about the Cold Harbor. I don't like using Reddit anymore. I think that it can be very testy, although I know there's very incredibly smart people and individuals over there. So yeah, I think that this just has something to do with creating a more perfect human and a more perfect human ratio. And maybe that is related to how the macrodata refiners are working, but it might just be, in general, a way that they're trying to perfect macrodata refinement. Anyway, these are all the major things I wanted to discuss from the season 2 Severance premiere. I thought the episode was definitely slower paced. I didn't enjoy it as much. I think I really killed it because I did watch that 8-minute preview to the episode that was released like 2 weeks prior to the actual premiere. That was a bad mistake because I think it kind of ruined my anticipation for what's going on. And I would say that in general, and compared to what happened in the last episode of season 1, I think that there's so much energy there that I wanted to be channeled into something actively productive, but I just didn't see it as much. So I wasn't that excited about this episode, but I definitely could see how it's laying the groundwork for something really exciting. With that being said, thank you for watching this video, and I can't wait to talk more about the second episode, which is going to be released tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern. Anyway, thank you, and this was Strategic Delusion.